Hey there, story lovers. Before we dive into today's wild tale, I've got a quick question for you. Have you ever had a neighbor who just wouldn't leave you alone? Maybe they complained about your dog barking, or your bike on the grass, or even the way you wave hello. Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear all about it. Oh, and while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from today. Are you on your couch, in your bedroom, or maybe sneaking a peek during lunch at school? And here's the big one: if you love stories packed with twists, drama, and a huge scoop of justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming in this story. It's going to be a wild ride. Now, let's get started. Picture this: it was just another sunny afternoon in the quiet little neighborhood of Sunnyvale Estates. The sun was shining bright, painting the sky a big, happy blue. Birds were chirping their favorite songs, hopping from tree to tree. Kids were playing in the street, riding bikes and kicking soccer balls, laughing so loud you could hear them from blocks away. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. It was the kind of day that made you want to run outside and enjoy every second of it. And there, in the middle of all this happiness, was Jake Thompson. Jake was in his front yard, holding a green watering can, pouring water on his pretty flowers. His yard was his happy place. He had roses that were red like apples, daisies that were white like snow, and tulips that were yellow like sunshine. Every day after work, Jake would come outside, put on his old straw hat, and take care of his garden. He'd pull weeds, trim bushes, and talk to his plants like they were his best friends. "Looking good, roses," he'd say, or "hang in there, daisies, you'll bloom soon." Jake was the kind of guy everyone liked. He was friendly, always smiling, and super nice to everyone. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries, Jake was there. If a kid's ball rolled into his yard, Jake would kick it back with a big grin. Everyone in Sunnyvale Estates thought Jake was the best. Well, almost everyone. Because there was one person in the neighborhood who didn't like Jake. Not one bit. And her name was Karen. Now, this wasn't just any Karen. Oh no. This was HOA Karen. What's an HOA, you ask? It stands for Homeowners Association, which is like a club for people who live in the neighborhood. They make rules to keep everything nice and perfect. And Karen? She was the boss of the HOA. She was the queen of rules, the master of complaints, and the neighborhood's biggest nightmare. Karen walked around with a clipboard, writing down every little thing she didn't like. A mailbox that was a tiny bit crooked? Karen wrote it down. A trash can left out 1 minute past pickup time? Karen wrote it down. A kid drawing with chalk on the sidewalk? You guessed it, Karen wrote it down. To everyone else, Jake was just a regular guy trying to enjoy his home. He wasn't loud, he wasn't messy, and he always followed the rules well, almost always. Because there was one tiny, silly thing in Jake's front yard that Karen hated more than anything else in the world: a garden gnome. Yes, you heard that right, a garden gnome. It was a little statue, no taller than your knee, with a pointy red hat, a big white beard, and a happy smile on its face. It just sat there by the flower bed, holding a tiny lantern, looking cheerful and friendly. Jake loved his gnome. He thought it was funny and cute, and it made his garden feel special. He even gave it a name, Gnomeo. Every morning, Jake would pat Gnomeo on the head and say, "Good morning, buddy. Keep an eye on the flowers while I'm at work, okay?" But to Karen, that gnome was not cute. Oh no. To Karen, that gnome was a crime. A big, fat crime against the neighborhood standards. See, Karen thought everything in Sunnyvale Estates had to be perfect, and to her, perfect meant no fun, no silliness, and definitely no garden gnomes. She thought Gnomeo was tacky, ugly, and embarrassing. "It's ruining our property values," she'd yell, waving her clipboard in the air. "It's making our neighborhood look like a circus." Karen would stand on her porch, right across the street from Jake's house, and stare at Gnomeo with her mean, squinty eyes. She'd mutter to herself, "That gnome has to go. That gnome has to go." And then she'd march over to Jake's yard, her flip-flops slapping the pavement, and start yelling. "Jake Thompson," she'd shout. "Get rid of that ugly thing right now. It's against the rules. The HOA says no tacky decorations, and that gnome is the tackiest thing I've ever seen." Jake would just smile, tip his straw hat, and say, "Good afternoon, Karen. I think Nomeo looks pretty nice, don't you? He's just keeping my flowers company. But Karen didn't think it was funny. Not at all. She'd huff and puff, her face turning redder than a fire truck, and stomp back to her house, muttering about fines and lawyers and all kinds of scary things. Now, here's the thing, Jake wasn't doing anything wrong. The HOA rule said you couldn't have big, loud, or dangerous things in your yard like a giant bounce house or a broken down car. But a tiny garden gnome? That wasn't against the rules. Not really. Karen was just making stuff up because she didn't like Jake. She thought he was too happy, too friendly, too different. And Karen didn't like different. She liked everything to be the same, boring, and perfect, just like her. But what Karen didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jake wasn't just a regular guy with a garden gnome. Oh no. Jake had a secret. A big, huge, super duper secret. And every time Karen yelled at him, every time she complained about Nomeo, she was making a big mistake. Because little did she know, her obsession with that gnome was about to turn her whole world upside down. And here's the craziest part of all, Karen had no idea that the police were already on their way to Sunnyvale Estates, but not for Jake. Nope. They were coming for someone else. Someone who had done something very, very bad. What do you think Karen did to get herself in so much trouble? Was it something sneaky? Something mean? Something against the law? Drop your guesses in the comments below, and let's see who can figure it out first. But trust me, you'll want to stick around, because the story is about to get wild. Oh, and one more question before we move on. Have you ever had something you loved that someone else hated, like Jake's gnome? Maybe it was a toy, a shirt, or even a pet. Share your story in the comments, I can't wait to read them. Now, hold on tight, because things are about to get even crazier in Sunnyvale Estates. Jake loved his garden. It was his happy place, the best spot in the whole wide world, where he could relax and forget all his worries after a long day at work. Imagine coming home after sitting at a desk all day, your back sore, your eyes tired, and then stepping outside to see bright flowers smiling up at you. That's how Jake felt. He'd spent months, planting flowers, trimming bushes, and making everything look pretty. He had red roses, white daisies, and yellow tulips, all lined up in neat little rows. And yes, he added that little garden gnome for a bit of fun. That gnome, with its pointy red hat and big white beard, sat by the flower bed, holding a tiny lantern, looking happy and silly. Jake loved it. He called it Nomeo, and every morning, he'd pat its head and say, "Good morning, buddy. Keep those flowers safe today, okay?" But every time Jake stepped outside, every single time, there she was, Karen. Picture this, Karen, standing on her porch across the street, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her eyes squinting like she'd just eaten a sour lemon. She'd glare at Jake like he'd just robbed a bank, or kicked a puppy, or done something really, really bad. But Jake hadn't done anything bad. Not at all. He was just watering his flowers, humming a happy tune, and enjoying his day. But to Karen, Jake was trouble. Big trouble. Karen wasn't just annoying, she was mean. Super mean. Meaner than a grumpy cat stuck in a rainstorm. She'd yell at Jake from her porch, her voice loud and sharp, cutting through the quiet neighborhood like a knife. "Those flowers are 2 inches too tall," she'd scream, pointing at Jake's roses like they were monsters. "The HOA rules say flowers can't be taller than 10 inches, and yours are 12. I measured them." Or she'd yell, "That gnome is an eyesore. It's ugly and tacky. The HOA rules say no tacky decorations, and that gnome is the tackiest thing I've ever seen." Jake would just smile, tip his straw hat, and say, "Good morning, Karen," or "Have a nice day, Karen." He'd wave at her with a big, friendly wave, like he didn't care about her yelling. But inside, deep down, Jake was getting tired. Tired of her yelling, tired of her complaints, tired of her mean words. It was like every day, Karen found something new to complain about. If it wasn't the flowers, it was the gnome. If it wasn't the gnome, it was the way Jake parked his car always 1 inch too close to the curb, according to Karen. It was exhausting, like trying to play a game where the rules kept changing, and you could never win. Karen didn't just yell, though. Oh no. She did more than that. She was sneaky, too. She'd write letters to the HOA board, those grown UPS who made the neighborhood rules, saying Jake was breaking the law. She'd take pictures of Jake's yard with her big, fancy camera, zooming in on the gnome like it was a dangerous criminal. She'd even knock on Jake's door bang, 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 just to lecture him about property values. Property values are how much houses are worth, and Karen thought Jake's gnome was making all the houses worth less money. This neighborhood is supposed to be fancy, she'd say, her nose stuck up in the air like she smelled something bad. Your silly gnome is ruining everything. Once, Karen said something really, really mean. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Jake was outside, pulling weeds from his garden. Karen marched over, her flip-flops slapping the pavement, her clipboard in her hand, and her face redder than a ripe tomato. She pointed at Jake and said, "People like you don't belong in a nice neighborhood like this." Ouch. That hurt. That hurt a lot. Imagine someone saying you don't belong in your own home, just because you like flowers and a funny gnome. Jake felt a big lump in his throat, like he wanted to cry, but he didn't. He just stood up, brushed the dirt off his hands, and said, "I think I belong here just fine, Karen. Have a good day." Then he went back to pulling weeds, pretending her words didn't sting like a bee. But here's the thing, Jake stayed calm. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He didn't call Karen names, even though she called him plenty. He just kept watering his flowers, trimming his bushes, and smiling at his gnome. Every morning, he'd pat Gnomeo on the head and say, "Don't listen to her, buddy. You're perfect just the way you are." And every evening, he'd sit on his porch, sipping lemonade, watching the sunset, and trying to forget Karen's mean words. Jake was patient. Jake was kind. Jake was strong, even if Karen didn't see it. What Karen didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Jake wasn't just a regular guy. Nope. Jake had a secret. A big, huge, super-duper secret. And every time Karen picked on him, every time she yelled, every time she wrote a mean letter or took a sneaky picture, she was digging herself into a deeper hole. A hole so deep, she'd never climb out. Karen thought Jake was weak, just a silly man with a silly gnome. She thought she could push him around, scare him, make him leave. But oh, how wrong she was. Karen was about to learn a big lesson, a lesson she'd never forget. Have you ever met someone who judged you before they even knew you? Maybe it was a kid at school who said your shoes were weird, or a teacher who thought you couldn't do math, or a neighbor who didn't like your dog. Drop your story in the comments below, because I bet Jake would relate. Think about how it felt to be judged, to be treated unfairly, to be told you didn't belong. That's exactly how Jake felt, day after day, with Karen yelling and glaring and being mean. But here's a little hint, Karen's about to learn that judging people can come back to bite you, big time. Oh yes, something big is coming, something wild, something that will turn this quiet neighborhood upside down. So stick around, because you won't believe what happens next. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's complaints got worse. Way worse. It was like every day, Karen found a new reason to be mean to Jake. If the sun was shining, she'd complain about his flowers being too bright. If it was raining, she'd say his garden was too muddy. And if it was a perfect day, well, she'd just complain about his gnome, always that poor little gnome. Jake tried to stay calm, tried to keep smiling, but inside, it was getting harder. Imagine someone yelling at you every single day, pointing fingers, calling you names, making you feel like you're doing everything wrong. That's how Jake felt, day after day, with Karen being her mean, grumpy self. One morning, Jake woke up early, ready to water his flowers and enjoy a quiet start to his day. But when he opened his front door, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, taped to his door, was a bright red notice. It was big, bold, and screaming at him in giant black letters. Jake pulled it off and read it, his eyes squinting in the morning sun. The note was from the HOA, signed by Karen herself, in her big, messy handwriting. It said, "Remove the garden gnome by 5 p.m. today, or face a $500 fine." $500. That's a lot of money, more money than most kids get for allowance in a whole year. Jake just stared at the note, his mouth open, his eyebrows up high. Then, he did something surprising. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't even get mad. Instead, he shook his head, let out a little chuckle, and whispered to himself, "Oh, Karen, you have no idea what's coming." Now, most people, when they get a mean note like that, might feel scared or sad. They might run outside, grab the gnome, and hide it in the garage, just to avoid trouble. But not Jake. Oh no. Jake wasn't scared. Jake wasn't sad. Jake had a plan, a clever, sneaky, super smart plan. And that note? It just made him more determined to have a little fun. So, that afternoon, Jake decided to do something bold, something brave, something that would drive Karen up the wall. Picture this, Jake, in his old straw hat, walking out to his garden with a big grin on his face. In his hands, he held Gnomeo, his little garden gnome with the red hat and white beard. Jake looked around, making sure Karen wasn't watching, and then he did something sneaky. He took his gnome and moved it 2 feet closer to Karen's property line. 2 whole feet. That meant Gnomeo was now closer to Karen's yard than ever before, sitting there with his happy smile, his tiny lantern glowing in the sun. But Jake didn't stop there. Oh no. He went back inside, grabbed a piece of paper, and made a tiny sign. On the sign, he wrote, in big, bold letters, "Gnome, sweet gnome." Then he stuck the sign right next to Gnomeo, so everyone walking by could see it. Jake stepped back, looked at his work, and nodded. Perfect, he said to himself. Then he grabbed a cup of coffee, sat on his porch, and waited to see what would happen. It didn't take long. Not long at all. Sure enough, Karen stormed out of her house, her flip-flops slapping the pavement, her face redder than a ripe tomato. She looked like a volcano about to explode, steam practically coming out of her ears. "This is outrageous," she screamed, pointing at Gnomeo and the sign. "You think this is a joke? Moving that ugly thing closer to my yard? Putting up a silly sign? You're making fun of me, Jake Thompson, and I won't stand for it." Jake just sipped his coffee, calm as a cucumber, and smiled. "I think Gnomeo looks happy there, Karen," he said, his voice soft and friendly. "And the sign? Just a little fun, that's all." But Karen didn't think it was fun. Not one bit. She stomped her foot so hard, the ground shook. "Fun," she yelled. "Fun. This isn't fun, Jake. This is a disgrace. That gnome is a public nuisance, and you're breaking the law. I'm calling the police. Right now." Jake just leaned back in his chair, still sipping his coffee, and said, "Go ahead, Karen. Call them." His voice was so calm, so steady, it made Karen even madder. She thought Jake was scared, thought he was weak, thought he'd beg her not to call. But Jake wasn't scared. Not at all. And here's why: Jake knew something Karen didn't. Something big. Something secret. Karen pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking with anger, and dialed 911. She started yelling into it, her voice so loud the whole neighborhood could hear. "Hello? Yes, police. There's a man in my neighborhood breaking the law. He's harassing me with an ugly garden statue. I demand an officer come right now." The dispatcher, the person on the other end of the phone, tried to calm her down. "Ma'am, please, is this really an emergency?" they asked. But Karen wouldn't listen. "Of course it's an emergency," she shrieked. "This is a crime. A crime against our neighborhood. Send someone now." Then she hung up, crossed her arms, and glared at Jake, a big, smug smile on her face. "You're in trouble now, Jake," she said. "Big trouble." Jake just smiled back, sipping his coffee, not saying a word. But inside, he was thinking, "Oh, Karen, you're the one in trouble. Big, big trouble." See, what Karen didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the police were already on their way to Sunnyvale Estates. But they weren't coming for Jake. Oh no. They were coming for someone else, someone who had done something very wrong, something sneaky, something against the law. And here's a little hint, that someone's name started with AK. Can you guess who it might be? Think hard, because the answer is closer than you think. While Karen stood there, gloating, thinking she'd won, Jake watched her closely. He noticed things, small things, but important things. Like how Karen's hands shook when she yelled, like she was nervous about something. Like how she kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was afraid someone was watching her. Jake filed those little details away in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle he was putting together. Every shout, Every mean word, every sneaky move Karen made, it was all part of the picture, a picture that was getting clearer every day. What do you think Karen did to get the police's attention? Was it something sneaky, like stealing? Was it something mean, like lying? Was it something big, like breaking a really important rule? Drop your guesses in the comments below, and let's see who can figure it out first. But trust me, the truth is crazier than anything you can imagine. And here's another question to think about: have you ever stood up to someone mean, even in a small way, like Jake did with his gnome? Maybe you said no to a bully, or kept doing something you loved even when someone made fun of it. Share your story in the comments, I can't wait to read them. Now, hold on tight, because this story is about to get even wilder. Just as Karen hung up the phone, slamming it down with a big, smug smile on her face, something happened. Something big. Two police cars pulled into the neighborhood, rolling down the street slow and steady. Their lights were flashing red and blue, spinning around like a carnival ride. Their sirens were off, so it was quiet, but you could tell they meant business. Serious business. The cars stopped right in front of Jake's house, their tires crunching on the pavement. Everyone in the neighborhood peeked out their windows, opened their doors, and stepped outside to see what was going on. Kids stopped kicking their soccer balls. Moms stopped pushing their strollers. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping, like they knew something huge was about to happen. Karen's eyes lit up with glee, brighter than a Christmas tree. She clapped her hands together, her smile stretching so wide it looked like it might split her face in half. Finally, she said, pointing at Jake with a long, bony finger. "Officers, arrest this man. He's the one breaking the rules. He's the one harassing me with that ugly gnome. Get him out of here." She was so happy, so sure she'd won, that she started bouncing on her toes, like a kid who just got the biggest ice cream cone in the world. Jake, though. Jake didn't move. He didn't jump up. He didn't yell. He didn't even look scared. He just leaned back in his chair, still sipping his coffee, calm as a kitten sleeping in the sun. He watched the police cars, watched the officers step out, and took another slow sip of his coffee, like he was watching a boring TV show. Karen thought he was scared, thought he was trapped, thought she'd finally beat him. But oh, how wrong she was. So wrong. The officers stepped out of their cars, two of them, big and tall, wearing dark blue uniforms and shiny badges that sparkled in the sun. One officer was a tall man with a serious face, his eyebrows scrunched together like he was solving a hard math problem. The other was a shorter woman, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes sharp like a hawk. They looked around, scanning the street, their hands resting on their belts. Karen waved at them, jumping up and down, pointing at Jake like he was a monster. "Over here, officers," she yelled. "It's him. It's him. Arrest him now." But instead of walking toward Jake, instead of even looking at Jake, the officers turned, and started walking straight toward Karen. Step by step, their boots thumping on the pavement, they got closer and closer to her. Karen's smug smile disappeared faster than ice cream on a hot day. Her mouth dropped open, her eyes got wide, and her face turned pale, like she'd just seen a ghost. "Wait, what?" she stammered, her voice shaking. No. You've got the wrong person. It's him. It's Jake. He's the criminal. Not me. Not me." The tall officer stopped right in front of Karen, his serious face looking down at her. He held up a piece of paper, a white sheet covered in black writing, and said, "Karen Phillips." His voice was deep, like thunder rolling in the sky. Karen nodded, her eyes so wide they looked like they might pop out of her head. Why yes," she whispered, her voice tiny and scared. The officer didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just said, "You're under arrest for fraud, theft, and falsifying HOA documents." The whole neighborhood went silent. Dead silent. You could hear a pin drop, or a leaf fall, or a butterfly flap its wings. Everyone froze, neighbors, kids, even the dogs stopped barking. Karen's jaw hit the ground, her mouth open so wide you could see all her teeth. "What are you talking about?" she screamed, her voice cracking like a broken toy. "This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here. I'm the one who called you. It's Jake. It's Jake." She pointed at Jake again, her finger shaking, her face redder than a fire truck now, but this time from fear, not anger. That's when Jake stood up, slow and steady, setting his coffee cup down on the porch table with a little clink. He stretched his arms, cracked his neck, and walked over to the officers, calm as could be. "Thanks for coming, guys," he said, his voice friendly and warm, like he was greeting old friends. Then he reached into his mailbox, right there by his front door, and pulled out a thick folder, stuffed full of papers. He handed it to the officers, a big smile on his face. "I've got all the evidence you need right here," he said. Karen's face turned pale, paler than a sheet of paper, paler than snow in winter. What is that?" she whispered, her voice so quiet you could barely hear it. Her eyes were glued to the folder, like it was a bomb about to explode. The tall officer opened the folder, flipping through the papers, his serious face getting even more serious. He started reading out loud, his voice clear and strong. "Looks like you've been skimming money from the HOA budget, Karen," he said. "Thousands of dollars, all funneled into your personal account. And those fines you've been charging people? All fake. You even forged signatures to make it look legit." Karen's eyes got wider, her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. She looked around, at the neighbors, at the officers, at Jake, her face a mix of fear and anger. Then, suddenly, she turned and tried to run, her flip-flops slipping on the pavement. But the second officer, the woman with the sharp eyes, was too fast. She grabbed Karen's arm, strong and steady, and said, "You're not going anywhere." Karen yanked her arm, screaming, "Let me go. This is a mistake. I didn't do anything." But the officer didn't let go. She held on tight, like a dog with a bone. Meanwhile, Jake turned to the growing crowd of neighbors, who were now standing on their lawns, watching with big, wide eyes. He smiled, a big, friendly smile, and said, "Oh, and by the way, I'm not just your friendly neighbor. I'm an undercover investigator. I've been watching Karen for months." Boom. Mind's blown, right? Imagine that. Jake, the guy everyone thought was just a silly man with a silly gnome, was actually a secret investigator, like a superhero in disguise. The neighbors gasped, their mouths open, their eyes wide. Kids whispered, "Whoa." Moms clapped their hands. Dads nodded, like they always knew Jake was special. And Karen? Karen looked like she'd been hit by a truck, her face frozen in shock, her body limp in the officer's grip. What would you do if you found out your annoying neighbor was actually a criminal? Would you cheer? Would you gasp? Would you run and hide? Drop your reactions in the comments below, because this story is just heating up. And here's another question to think about: have you ever been surprised by someone who turned out to be way cooler than you thought? Maybe a quiet kid at school who was secretly a math genius, or a shy friend who could sing like a superstar. Share your story in the comments, I can't wait to read them. Now, hold on tight, because the story isn't over yet. As the officers handcuffed Karen, snapping the shiny metal cuffs around her wrists, and led her to the police car, the neighbors went wild. They started clapping, loud and fast, their hands smacking together like thunder. "Way to go, Jake," someone shouted, their voice booming across the street. "You're a hero," another yelled, jumping up and down like they just won a big game. Kids cheered, moms smiled, and dads nodded, all looking at Jake with big, happy eyes. Jake just smiled, a big, warm smile, and waved his hand, like he was saying hi to old friends. "Just doing my job, folks," he said, his voice soft and friendly, like nothing big had happened. But oh, something big had happened. Something huge. Later that day, when the sun was starting to set and the sky turned orange and pink, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Everyone in the neighborhood came, crowding into the community center, sitting on chairs and standing in the back. With Karen gone, locked up in the police car, they needed a new president, someone fair, someone kind, someone who actually cared about the neighborhood, not just about yelling and making rules. They talked, they voted, and guess what? They picked someone new, someone who loved flowers and kids and even silly things like garden gnomes. And here's the best part, they voted to change the rules, too. From now on, garden gnomes were officially allowed. No more fines, no more yelling, no more mean notes. Gnomes were free to live in every yard, happy and safe. Jake's garden became the talk of the town. People came from all over, driving their cars, riding their bikes, even walking from far away, just to see the famous gnome that brought down HOA Karen. They'd stand by Jake's fence, pointing at Gnomeo, taking pictures and laughing. "That's the little guy who did it," they'd say. Jake thought it was funny, so he decided to have a little fun. He went to the store, bought a second gnome, this one with a blue hat and a big smile, and set it right next to Gnomeo. Now he had two happy gnomes, guarding his flowers, making his garden even more special. And every time he watered his flowers, he'd look at the gnomes and chuckle, a big, happy laugh. "Thanks, little guys," he'd say, patting their heads. "You did good." As for Karen, well, she faced a big trial. A trial is like a big meeting in a courtroom, where people decide if you did something wrong and what your punishment should be. The evidence Jake had collected, the stuff in that thick folder, was airtight, which means it was perfect, with no holes, no mistakes. There were bank records, showing all the money Karen stole. There were emails, proving she lied and tricked people. There was even security camera footage, like a movie, of her sneaking into the HOA office late at night, taking papers and hiding them in her bag. The judge, the person in charge, looked at all this evidence, listened to Jake, and said, "Karen, you're guilty. Guilty means you did the bad thing, and you have to pay for it." Karen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which is like a big timeout for grown-ups, where you have to stay in a locked room and can't leave. Plus, she had to pay a huge fine, giving back all the money she stole, every single penny. The neighborhood was finally peaceful again. No more yelling, no more mean notes, no more Karen stomping around with her clipboard. Kids played in the street, laughing and running. Moms and dads sat on their porches, sipping lemonade, smiling at each other. And the best part? Everyone learned to be a little kinder, a little less judgmental, and a lot more careful about who they picked on. They learned that being mean can get you in big trouble, and being nice, like Jake, can make you a hero. Isn't it satisfying to see justice served? That means seeing the bad guy get punished and the good guy win. Let me know in the comments if you think Karen got what she deserved, or if you'd have handled things differently. Oh, and one more question: have you ever seen someone mean get caught, like Karen did? Maybe at school, or at home, or in a game. Drop your story in the comments, I can't wait to read them. And there you have it, folks, the wild, crazy, super fun story of how a garden gnome brought down the neighborhood bully. Can you believe it? A tiny little statue, with a red hat and a big smile, helped catch a big, mean bully like Karen. It's funny, right? But it's also so much more than funny. It's a story about being strong, being fair, and never giving up, even when someone is mean to you. Let's talk about what we can learn from Jake and his gnome, because this story has some big, important lessons that can help us all. Think about Jake for a minute. To Karen, Jake looked weak, like just a silly guy with a silly gnome. She thought he was easy to pick on, easy to scare, easy to push around. But Jake wasn't weak. Oh no. Jake was strong, super strong, because he stayed calm, he stayed kind, and he didn't let Karen's mean words stop him. Sometimes, the people who seem the weakest, the ones who are quiet, the ones who don't yell back, turn out to be the strongest. Like Jake. He didn't fight with fists or loud words. He fought with smarts, with patience, and with a big, clever plan. And guess what? He won. Big time. Now think about Karen. Karen judged Jake before she even knew him. She looked at his gnome, looked at his flowers, and decided he didn't belong. She thought she was better, smarter, stronger. But here's the thing, those who judge others, like Karen, might just be hiding their own secrets. Karen was mean, but she was also sneaky, stealing money, lying, breaking rules. And in the end, her judging, her meanness, came back to bite her, like a big, angry dog. So, what does that teach us? It teaches us to be fair, to be kind, to not judge people just because they're different, or quiet, or like silly things like garden gnomes. So here's your takeaway, your big lesson to remember: be kind. Be fair. And never underestimate the quiet guy next door, or his garden gnome. That means don't be quick to think someone is weak or silly, because they might be stronger than you know. It means don't be mean, don't judge, because you never know what secrets someone else might have or what secrets you might be hiding. And most of all, it means be strong, like Jake, even when things are hard, even when people are mean, because if you keep going, if you keep being kind, you can win, just like he did. Thanks for watching, everyone. Wasn't that story wild? If you loved it, give it a big thumbs up, like a big high five to Jake and his gnome. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you can hear more tales of justice, drama, and epic twists, just like this one. Oh, and I need your help. What kind of story do you want to hear next? Maybe a story about a kid who beats a bully, or a dog who saves the day, or a teacher who turns out to be a superhero. Drop your ideas in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay awesome, be kind, be strong, and maybe get yourself a garden gnome. You never know when it might come in handy. Here's one last question to think about: have you ever been strong like Jake, standing up to someone mean, or staying calm when things were hard? Drop your story in the comments, I can't wait to read them. See you soon, story lovers. Hey there, story lovers. Before we dive into today's wild tale, I've got a quick question for you. Have you ever had a neighbor who just wouldn't leave you alone? Maybe they complained about your dog barking, or your bike on the grass, or even the way you wave hello. Drop your answer in the comments below, I want to hear all about it. Oh, and while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from today. Are you on your couch, in your bedroom, or maybe sneaking a peek during lunch at school? And here's the big one: if you love stories packed with twists, drama, and a huge scoop of justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming in this story. It's going to be a wild ride. Now, let's get started. Picture this: it was just another sunny afternoon in the quiet little neighborhood of Sunnyvale Estates. The sun was shining bright, painting the sky a big, happy blue. Birds were chirping their favorite songs, hopping from tree to tree. Kids were playing in the street, riding bikes and kicking soccer balls, laughing so loud you could hear them from blocks away. The air smelled like fresh cut grass and blooming flowers. It was the kind of day that made you want to run outside and enjoy every second of it. And there, in the middle of all this happiness, was Jake Thompson. Jake was in his front yard, holding a green watering can, pouring water on his pretty flowers. His yard was his happy place. He had roses that were red like apples, daisies that were white like snow, and tulips that were yellow like sunshine. Every day after work, Jake would come outside, put on his old straw hat, and take care of his garden. He'd pull weeds, trim bushes, and talk to his plants like they were his best friends. "Looking good, roses," he'd say, or "hang in there, daisies, you'll bloom soon." Jake was the kind of guy everyone liked. He was friendly, always smiling, and super nice to everyone. If a neighbor needed help carrying groceries, Jake was there. If a kid's ball rolled into his yard, Jake would kick it back with a big grin. Everyone in Sunnyvale Estates thought Jake was the best, well, almost everyone. Because there was one person in the neighborhood who didn't like Jake. Not one bit. And her name was Karen. Now, this wasn't just any Karen. Oh no. This was HOA Karen. What's an HOA, you ask? It stands for Homeowners Association, which is like a club for people who live in the neighborhood. They make rules to keep everything nice and perfect. And Karen? She was the boss of the HOA. She was the queen of rules, the master of complaints, and the neighborhood's biggest nightmare. Karen walked around with a clipboard, writing down every little thing she didn't like. A mailbox that was a tiny bit crooked? Karen wrote it down. A trash can left out 1 minute past pickup time? Karen wrote it down. A kid drawing with chalk on the sidewalk? You guessed it, Karen wrote it down. To everyone else, Jake was just a regular guy trying to enjoy his home. He wasn't